It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Nick Gabriele. Nick, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Rich, and thank you, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us in this first of a series of webinars on emergency preparedness sponsored by the Northeast Florida Regional Council. My name is Nick Gabriele, and I'm with Russell Phillips Associates, a Jensen Hughes company. We are excited to be part of this, and we'll be presenting several of these sessions, and enjoy that our first session is on the hazard vulnerability assessments, a little bit of a deep dive into what they are, how you can complete them, and to review some tools that we have provided. As a brief reminder, I know a few of you joined us a few seconds after Rich mentioned this. In the lower right of your screen is a file icon. You will find in that file icon two versions of a hazard vulnerability assessment. One is a PDF version. I would suggest that if you can, print that out during this presentation. It will be helpful to review as we go through this. The other version is an Excel version, which is there for your use so that when you complete your HVA, it is usable in that Excel version. We here at Russell Phillips Associates are excited to be part of this presentation. Our background is that we're a national firm that works with healthcare facilities across the country, and we work specifically in the emergency management and fire safety areas. A little bit about our firm, just as before we talk about HVAs, because it pertains to how we approach the concept of assessing risk. We work through our process in what we call three spheres of influence. One, of course, is requirements, and so we'll speak a little bit this afternoon about CMS and other authorities having jurisdiction requirements for an HVA. But then I think most importantly, we also are involved with some 1,200 facilities across the country. We also get to review incidents after they happen and find out what went right, what went wrong. And from those lessons learned, we identify best practices from across the industry. And that's part of our research of our response. And together, that gives us a good handle on how we can help facilities and help healthcare providers be more efficient and successfully meet these new emergency preparedness program requirements. One of the reasons we're here, of course, is that CMS has published back in 2013 new requirements, and 3 years later they published the final rule on those requirements, and those rules were then implemented and had to be compliant in November of 2017. Now, we work with facilities and providers across the country, and we understand that people today are still struggling with meeting the fundamental requirements of these new standards. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to be part of this, to offer some solutions specifically for the hazard vulnerability assessments, and we look forward to providing you with that. When we look at those requirements, they really are built around the four core elements of emergency preparedness. And it's worth a quick review just to talk about those four parts, although this particular seminar is really going to focus on the first one. But one of the core elements is that each provider conduct an annual risk assessment and that they build their emergency planning based on that risk assessment. That risk assessment needs to be an all hazards approach. So it's important that you cover all potential hazards. And the only way you can do that is if you have a tool to help you do that. The second cornerstone is your policies and procedures. And that's probably a seminar for another day, but every facility, every provider needs to have certain policies and procedures that are based on those risk assessments, and they need to be updated annually. An important component, and I think an interesting part of these new regulations, is the concept of a communication plan. Communication plans for emergency preparedness used to look like lists of equipment and redundancies. And that's still a valid part of a communication plan, but the new requirements broaden the concept of a communication plan to How will you communicate with families, residents, families, staff, providers? So all that now is part of this larger picture of what we call a communications plan. Of course, another important component of the new regulations are training and testing, and there's plenty of requirements built around those things, but I want to bring it back to the concept that your annual risk assessment should also be helping to drive what you're training and testing on as well, and we'll look at how that comes into play as you conduct your annual hazard vulnerability assessment. There's two other parts of the requirements that are worth mentioning, just so you don't forget about them. One has to do, of course, with emergency power, which I know Florida is very ingrained in and aware of, and the fact that Florida is expanded upon the basic CMS requirements for their own state requirements. And then the second part of these regulations that's worth mentioning is the concept of integrated health systems. And the concept there is pretty straightforward. If you are an entity that's part of a larger organization, you can have a larger organization or system-wide plan, but it still has to be facility-specific. And that really comes into play when we talk about hazard vulnerability assessments, because even if you have a system-wide or organization-wide plan, you still need to conduct individual facility and potentially geographic risk assessments across your organization. And we'll talk more about that when we talk specifically about the HVAs. Now, the regulations are comprehensive, and they cover both inpatient and outpatient. The focus here is really on the inpatient today, is really on the inpatient providers, which include, of course, hospitals, ICF facilities, long-term care facilities, and these other facilities. So those facilities all have specific regulations. Almost all of them are pretty similar. All of the inpatient providers need to complete a formal hazard vulnerability assessment annually, so that's important to recognize. Some of the outpatient ones do as well, but again, the focus here is inpatient, and all of those on that list need to conduct an HVA. The other requirements that are in the new regulations vary by provider type. Some outpatient providers are not required to have certain policies and procedures. Long-term care and psychiatric facilities are required to share information with their residents and their family members. Hospitals don't have that requirement. So there are some minor differences, but in general, they're basically the same. And when we talk about the hazard vulnerability assessment, there is a requirement for every inpatient provider to conduct a annual risk assessment. We like to mention, and this is kind of a best practice concept here, is we recognize that there's probably CCRCs or facilities that have both skilled nursing and assisted living or independent living. And although these new regulations don't, because they only apply to Medicare and Medicaid providers, don't apply specifically to assisted living and independent living, we typically do fold them in because it is best practice and they deserve emergency preparedness programs too. So it's a good holistic approach, if that's what your organization looks like, to make sure you include those, even though they may not necessarily be required to be part of it to meet the CMS specific regulations. Now, if we talk about hazard vulnerability assessments or risk assessments, we have to start by talking about how you should be approaching meeting all the requirements. And it's important, and this is threaded throughout the new requirements, that it's not meant to be a one-person approach. It's not meant to be a one-time approach. It's really meant to be a culture change in those provider organizations. And a big part of that is that you need to establish and should be establishing an emergency preparedness team. And we mention this up front when we talk about assessments, because this team is the team that should be involved in an assessment. a facility director or a maintenance person certainly can conduct some of the risk assessments, but it also makes sense that you have a multidisciplinary approach that includes clinical and administrative support, administration, and others, because some of the risks or the hazards that we're going to be looking at will affect them, and they will better understand the ability to assess that risk. So step one is really establishing a team approach to your risk assessments. Establish a team leader, establish team membership, which should, again, be multidisciplinary. Let's be realistic. It should be scalable to your organization. It could be 2 or 3 people, or it could be larger, but you want to make sure that you have that multidisciplinary covered. You should get in a habit of meeting regularly. What we see a lot of providers doing today is meeting monthly, because there's a lot of work to be done to get up to compliance. At some point, I'm sure they could back off to quarterly, but realistically, this is something that needs a lot of attention. The HVA itself needs annual attention, but you're going to see a good HVA is a somewhat dynamic document in that hazards do change over time. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but there could be times where you change your assessment during the course of a year because of some situations. So the last point that's important to mention, and we can't stress this enough, is an important part of your team are your community partners. And I know you folks are very strong in the healthcare coalition area, that you are engaged on a regional basis, of course, but that also includes your local emergency managers, your local fire department, police, EMS, etc., need to be brought in, especially as it comes to bear on the risk assessment, because they will understand the larger risk outside of your organization and can offer some help there. You don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. It doesn't have to be a standalone team. It could be part of an existing team. Very often, this is the safety committee that also doubles as the emergency preparedness committee. So don't worry about that. That's certainly something that could be help you with that. Again, don't forget our community partners. Do what you need to do that you are going to be you need to do to engage them. A great example of this is a facility we work with. They had a terrific bistro. It was very lovely. It was right on the ground floor, and they had a simple rule that police or firemen that stopped by got free coffee. And as a former fire chief, I could say this: police and firemen like coffee. And so what that did, quite honestly, it did a couple of great things for them. It brought that community involvement into the facility. They got to know the residents. The residents love the interaction. At the same time, the staff and the officers got to know each other, and so it really created a nice relationship. So develop those partnerships not just during the events when you need them most, but on an ongoing basis. I mentioned that you need to be meeting regularly. We have here just a simple meeting agenda just to keep you in mind that you need to formalize what you may already be doing. And there's some good examples here of making sure that you meet regularly, and your HVA certainly should be part of that ongoing discussion. When we look at the emergency preparedness program, without a doubt, the hazard vulnerability assessment or risk assessment is the cornerstone. But there are many different parts to your emergency preparedness program that you need to incorporate. But the first step is this concept of an all-hazard review, often called the hazard vulnerability assessment. The HVA is a systematic approach, and that's a very important concept, a systematic approach to recognizing hazards that may affect the ability to care for your folks. The risks associated with each hazard are then analyzed to help you prioritize planning, mitigation, response, and recovery activities. That's right out of the standards, but you know what? It makes perfect sense. I've been in this business for a long time. People have been doing HVAs for a long time, and quite honestly, a lot of people have been doing HVAs, and putting them on a shelf until they look at them the next year. The annual risk assessment is designed as a starting point to guide your emergency preparedness planning activities across the spectrum. Planning, mitigation, response, recovery, training, everything comes back to the HVA. So it's important you spend the necessary time on it, and it's important you do that because it's required, right? So you have to do it, but it makes sense to do it because it's going to help you guide your program. So with that, I'm going to take a second and ask Rich to put up our first poll. Excuse me. And we have a question. We're going to have a couple of these for you throughout the presentation. So we're speaking to a good number of folks here. How often does your formal emergency preparedness committee meet? Never? Monthly? Quarterly? Well, it looks like we have some pretty good numbers. We only have a few people here. But it looks like we got quite a few people who are absolutely meeting on a regular basis, and monthly and quarterly seem to be the two highlights, which I totally get. So we appreciate that, and hopefully some of the information that you're going to get here you'll be able to bring back to those committees so that you can move forward and maybe take another look at your annual risk assessment. Why do we need an annual risk assessment? Because events happen, and you need to know what your risk is. And we have some examples up there, and hopefully you can see it well on your screen. That upper left picture is really a showstopper when we do some presentations. It's a showstopper because it really identifies the need for planning. That is in 2005, and those are nursing home and hospital patients who are placed on a luggage carrier, a baggage carrier, as they're waiting to be boarded onto a C-141 plane in South Texas Airport, Port Arthur. This is not where you want your residents to be. So this is and obviously an issue that we had folks not prepared on how they were going to package and evacuate patients and residents, and so we ended up on a baggage carrier. The one in the middle is from Doylestown, Pennsylvania. This was a result of a nursing home that evacuated due to a partial structure collapse. Rescue crews were called, and those folks were out in that parking lot for quite a while because they had no stopover points, right? They had nowhere nearby where they could run out and take care of their folks. Instead, they waited out in the parking lot until arrangements were made for them. On the right is we're up here, I'm here in the Northeast, so we're used to these. These are snow and ice storms that resulted in several days of loss of power. On the lower left, we have Pomerado, California, nursing home residents being loaded onto a bus, being evacuated because of wildfires. Obviously, we have a flood there in the middle, and that's in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And on the right is a interesting scenario of a hospital that had what I would call a bread and butter fire in an electrical vault, but it resulted in loss of air conditioning in the middle of summer and a need to potentially evacuate their patients. So we need to take a look annually at our risks so that we know what they are. And the second reason we need to do it is because it helps us prepare your program. It helps us with what plans we need, what plans we need to train on, what our mitigation plans need to be, and what our exercise and drill plans. What should the focus be for the year? What are our mitigation plans? Can we do something to mitigate this risk, or is it something we're going to have to be prepared for? And so those are the reasons that we need to do an HVA. How do we conduct an HVA? Step one is pick a model. There are several models out there. If you haven't heard of Asper Tracy, you should. You should visit their website. They have a very good collection of risk assessments. They're all valid. The most common one used is something developed by Kaiser Permanente. So that's a very common one that's used by facilities. But there's other models out there from Southern California, the Pennsylvania Department of Public Health, and others. So you have to pick a model, and any one of those models are designed in the same way. to provide you a systematic approach to addressing all hazards. So when we talk about an all hazards HVA, it's important that you take a look across the spectrum of what potentially could come into play at your specific facility. So if that's step one, is pick a model, then step two is that you're going to assemble your team to go through that list and go through that model. You're going to conduct, part of your assessment should be conducting a facility tour. And this means physically a walk around. We like to take that team through and walk through the building, top to bottom, down through the basement, and walk around the outside of the building. We certainly are going to be concerned, and we'll talk about this in a few seconds. We're certainly going to be looking at natural hazards. We're going to be looking at all kinds of external hazards. But the reality is we can't forget about our internal hazards. And are there simple things we can do to mitigate those hazards? And I'll give you two quick examples. One quick example was when we were taking a tour and we got to the generator room, which I'm sure you're familiar with generator rooms, basically barren rooms, all it has is in the generator. And in fact, this particular generator room also had a huge fan because it needed some kind of airflow for the particular generator that was in there. And lo and behold, in that generator room is also where they stacked all their cardboard for recycling. So simple mitigation is get rid of it before that generator fan kicks on, because that could certainly cause some problems. So it's a real simple example of taking that tour, going through the building, and always remember, when you're looking at risks, the ones closest to home are probably the most important and not dangerous to you. So include a facility tour as part of your assessment. But then we're, of course, going to come back now and step back from the facility and consider all hazards in the HVA. Your HVA is also going to be based, you're going to also consider your community hazard vulnerability assessments. And of course, you folks down there in the Northeast Florida Healthcare Coalition have developed one. I understand that a more current version, recent version, is being worked on right now as we speak. But these community vulnerability assessments often give you a very good idea of what the potential natural hazards are. They often also include other maybe human or other hazards, but they typically focus on natural and community type hazards. And so this is right out of yours, and you can see that they have prioritized the top 10 hazards in your area with technology as number one. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. That is floating to the top in a lot of people's HVAs because of cyber attacks and things like that. Of course, tropical cyclones, which includes hurricanes and other tropical storms in your area, floods, severe weather. So when we start looking at our facility HVA, we can use the information from the community one to guide us on what the probability is and what the community response potential is. And when we start looking at the facility, you'll understand we have to answer those questions, and often we can get that information out of the community HVA. All right, so let's talk about the risk assessment. No matter what model you use, it's based on three simple considerations. One, what's the likelihood this event is going to happen? And that's how you should approach it. Whatever you're talking about, whether it's a hurricane or active shooter, just put in your mind with the group, what is the likelihood this is going to happen? Is it high, is it low, is it medium? What is it? Second thing is, forget if it's going to happen. It does happen. All right, so now the second question is, this event, active shooter, hurricane, whatever we're talking about, it absolutely does happen. What is going to be the impact on my facility, right? Is it going to be a high impact or a low impact? And then the third question is, well, given all that, for this specific event that I'm talking about right now, whether it's a hurricane or active shooter, what have I done and what has my community done to mitigate that risk? Can I get some benefit because I've done some things to mitigate that risk? That is how all these annual risk assessments work. They use different calculations and some of the magic voodoo math in the background, but at the end of the day, those are the four fundamental questions. Now, the model we're going to focus in on is the one that we've provided you. This is an RPA model. We have developed this. It is based off of the Kaiser Permanente model, but we have kind of brought it to a little bit different level, but it's still very valid and we think a very good model. It is an all hazards model, and I'll take you through that. But you can see that our model asks those questions about probability, impact, and mitigation. And so we will go through that in a little bit more detail, but it includes probability, impact, and mitigation. And those are the three fundamental questions that we will be asking as we go through this. All right, so let's take a look at, in general, again, for any one of these hazards, once we start looking at the individual hazards, you're going to do it what I call concentric circle model. We're going to always look at these from a local facility level, and then what about the local town level, the state level or regional level, and then nationally. What is the possibility of this happening? What is the impact of this happening? All right. Nationally, things evolve and change. An example of a national impact is a little while ago, maybe about a year ago or so, there was a series of bomb threats that took place throughout the country, specifically targeting synagogues and Jewish community centers. And we had a lot of facilities that are tied to Jewish services, and that prompted some of those facilities to, kind of break out their hazard vulnerability assessments and recognize that their risk of a bomb threat during that phase was increased. And should they be doing something different at that time? And another example is if the CDC or the World Health Organization identified a national flu or pandemic concerns, certainly that's going to make those events rise on your probability, right? So just two examples of when we look at the risk, we do look at the facility and local and region, state, and national on what the possibility and probabilities are. When we look at the impact, and this is a good example. So we have here a facility. What are we going to look at? Well, we're going to look at the generator, the staffing, the resources, and all the things. We're going to do our walk around the building and make sure there's no holes into the building and security concerns and things like that. We pull back a little bit and we see locally that we have some other things to consider. There's a major transportation nearby. What cargo or hazardous materials are on the road or on the trains that are nearby our facility. If we pull back a little bit further even more, we identify that we might have some other hazards. Up there on the left, that happens to be a huge mall complex that might have had a glitch there, that these were not moving forward. Okay, so what I was speaking to was kind of starting here at the facility and working our way up, and on each one of these views, the point is that you need to look at what those hazards are. And this was the example of the transportation that was nearby. And then this one here is the example of the mall that's on the left. That if you remember a little while ago, there was some incidents with malls and fights involved. And then what factories or chemical plants or what else is in your community that's potentially a hazard. So let's look at the document that we actually gave you and kind of give you a step-by-step how to apply that hazard vulnerability assessment. If you choose ours, we hope you do now that you have it. This is how you do it. But if you choose another model, it's essentially the same kind of concept. In the model that we're giving you, it's the electronic version. That's why we gave you the Excel, where it says facility name. If you type in the name of your facility, it will populate it throughout the document. So that's just a little helpful hint there. When you look at that document, you will see that there are several tabs, and we have broken down our hazards by natural hazards, technological hazards, and human hazards. Sometimes people also have hazardous materials and things like that. We have those. They're just under these different buckets. So this is considered an all-hazard risk assessment, and I think you'll see that it's pretty complete. And if it's not complete enough, there are ways you can add additional hazards to consider as well. So that's the fundamentals of the assessment that we gave you. I wanted to talk a little bit about those steps. And we said that step one was to identify what's the probability it's going to occur. And so in our particular model, we call that out by 0 through 4, with 0 being that it's never going to occur here. And so an example of that is for you folks down there, I think we're pretty confident when you get to the blizzard hazard, you could probably put a 0, all right? If it's a significant snow event for you folks, then maybe it's a 1. But that's how this works. A 1 is unlikely to occur but possible in 10-year period. A 2 is likely to occur at least once in a 10-year period. A 3 will occur several times, and a 4 is less likely to occur frequently in a 10-year period. So it's a little bit subjective, but we've tried to make it a little bit more objective by putting some parameters in there. So any model that you choose will have similar questions under probability, but the bottom line is you will have to pick for every hazard, what is the probability that this is going to happen? The next question is about impact. And as I said, the question here is not whether it's going to or not, it happens. Whatever we're talking about, unless we gave that a 0. If we gave that a 0 under probability, give zeros all the way across. But if we give anything other than a 0, then we're going to say it's happening. And now what is the impact from a human level, property level, and business impact? And for each one of those, you will score it accordingly. You will score it accordingly based on a scale of 0 to 4. 0 again being that it's not going to happen, and a 1 being low, and a 4 being high on the potential impact to humans, property, or business. Again, a little subjective. That's why it's really helpful to have a good multidisciplinary team. I will tell you, having done a lot of these, the very first time is a little bit painful. It's not a 10-minute process. It's probably a couple of meetings to get through all these items. But once you do it the first time, then the annual or regular reviews become more of an adjustment and a discussion than going through each individual line. The next thing, though, if we talk after impact, we said we were going to consider is mitigation. What are we doing to mitigate this? What's our preparedness level? What's our internal response capabilities? And what's our external response capabilities? And we're going to go through each one of these as well and score them on a scale of, you guessed it, 0 to 4. And in this particular case, and I just like looking at the preparedness because I think that one's a pretty clean one, where it's asking us, do we have a plan in place? If we do, and everybody's trained on it. And a classic example for this one is active shooter. And I hate to keep bringing that up because that most likely is going to fall low on everybody's probability list, but it certainly falls high on the radar these days because of it certainly is a possibility. So for almost everybody, it's not high probability, but it's some probability. So what's going to make a difference on how this risk is scored is, do you have plans in place and have you trained your staff? If you have, then it's a 1. If we have some kind of plans in place, and we've talked about it with our leadership, but we really haven't talked to our staff about where hardened areas are in the building or what they should do, or we showed them videos on run, hide, fight, or whatever model you choose, but we really haven't talked to our staff about that, then it's probably a number 2 that you're going to score there. Updated plans, update to plans, but training's required, right? Or I'm sorry, it would actually be a 3, plans in place and training in development. So take a look at that and make sure, get an idea. That's how you're scoring preparedness. When we talk about response, it's pretty straightforward. Do we have sufficient resources available or no resources available? And we'll give an example of that in a few minutes, but that really is during the event, do we have resources? If this event happens, do we have resources? And so that speaks a little bit to, do we have staffing plans? Do we have places for staff to sleep? Because if we don't have all that in place, we're probably going to have to say limited resources, right? And mustering additional staff, not likely or maybe viable. It depends on if we have callback lists and things like that. All right, and then the last part of that is specifically to external response. And typically that's going to be, hey, we call 911, they're going to come, so they're readily available. But I'm sure you can relate during large events such as hurricanes, or for us up here, snowstorms, regional and local response isn't necessarily assured or likely. And so you have to be honest with yourselves and potentially score that a little bit differently based on the event that we're talking about. So when we look at those things, those are some good examples. Those are the questions that we're going to ask ourselves. We wanted to give one example and actually go through it. So this particular situation is a facility. It's right on a shore. So as you can see from the picture, it's a beautiful facility. It happens to be an inpatient hospice facility with a beautiful view of the ocean.
Slide.
I did.
Yeah, I don't see it yet. There you go. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. We look at that facility. It's right there on the shore. Without digging into the weeds, when we look at our community hazard risk assessment, they say that we are likely to have more than one event in 10 years. And this specific event is a hurricane or cyclone or high wind event. And so we need, in this case, we're scoring probability of 4. Well, if that hurricane actually hits the building, and right there on the shore, what's the likely human impact? Well, we're going to probably have to be honest and score that one a 3. And I'm hoping that you guys are actually getting these. All right? And in that case, a 3 is specifically a high acuity, low volume injuries or both. Right? If we had a direct hit, we're likely to have some kind of injuries. The property impact is also going to probably be a 3. Severe damage, right? Recovery is going to take a while. For business impact, well, let's be honest. We're probably going to have to terminate non-essential services, and our essential services are going to be interrupted. This is going to be a big event. So you can see how we score that based on our discussion amongst our group of what the impact would be. The next part is mitigation. Well, what's our preparedness? Well, in this case, in this particular example, this facility hasn't done what they had to do. And they actually have no plans in place and haven't trained on this particular event. So we're going to have to score them a 4 on that one. And they also have been a little bit behind, because when they talk about internal response, they know that they'll have the staff that are on duty, but they don't have good staff callback system. They don't have places set aside to care for staff and for them to bunker down. They haven't really considered if they're going to let staff bring pets or families in during an event. And so because of all this, they really aren't sure staff are going to come in if they're called, and so they're going to score that a 3. And in this example, for an external response, again, this is a large event, we're going to have to score the limited resources, probably prolonged response, unless it's life-threatening, which would be a 3. In our scenario, that gives us a relative risk of 79. So to show you how this relative risk works is if we now look after we do our HVA and recognize that 79 is probably going to put this as a top 10 risk in our group, what can we do to now change that risk? And if we came back a year later and we had our plans in place, so we can score this a 1, and we have our staffing plans in place and our callback lists, we have mass notification systems, we're doing everything right, so now we can score that a 1, our relative risk goes down. And likewise, it will go down on the overall list of high risks. So that's an example of how HVAs should be used and how HVAs can change based on how you answer those questions. Just as another example, I just wanted to mention this. What we didn't do here was talk about could we do something different here, like put in hurricane shutters or something different to reduce the business impact, for example. And we could, and if we did, then that number would potentially go down as well. So a real good example of how each one of these hazards should be looked at. So we're going to look at these not in that kind of depth and detail, but just to give you an idea of what is concluded in this risk assessment. Again, it's considered an all-hazard risk assessment. The first tab really deals with natural hazards, and so we're specifically talking about natural hazards here. And on the left-hand column, each type of hazard is specifically listed. The type of things that you'll find in the natural hazards column include, of course, thunderstorms, earthquakes, tidal waves, drought, wildfires. If they don't apply to you or you're a 0 probability, you put a 0 in, you're all set, right? If you put a 1 through a 4, you're going to have to fill out the rest of it, all right? So natural events are covered in there well. We don't have to look too far to recognize that natural hazards are probably one of the most important hazards that we're going to consider. Certainly the impact and the many nursing homes and other facilities that were evacuated during Irma right in your areas there and in Florida, and of course over in Houston for the other hurricane last year, gives us plenty of examples of considerations of natural hazards. Got another example here. This specific one is a long-term care facility. This happens to be up here in the Northeast in the Massachusetts area. It happened in 2006, and it's kind of an interesting story because it tells a story of an HVA going good and an HVA going bad, both in the same time. This particular picture is one of a large nursing home. It's called Mary Immaculate. It was what they call the Mother's Day storm, and the Spigot River, which abuts the facility, is normally a trickle. So what you see there is normally a small little trickle. I don't know why that just happened.
Yeah, sorry, Nick, you're going to have to make sure that the things, I advance that for you because I didn't see it advancing. But
sure. I will say that, just so you know, Rich, on my screen it's advancing.
Okay. Yep.
Every time we do that. So interesting side note. But anyways, so this particular story, again, this normally is a trickle, and as you can see, it wasn't on this Mother's Day storm. A dam in New Hampshire overflowed from the storms. Now, the good news is, based on a previous HVA, they did mitigation strategies were employed, and they identified that they were going to, if that happened, they were going to build the berm that you see there. All right, so that was perfect. They also set the generators that were low and set them up up above higher to get them out of the potential flood zone. So their HVA worked well there. Unfortunately, during this operation, a large piece of equipment, you can kind of see it there in the background. You can kind of see it there in the background, while they were moving that big piece of equipment, they actually breached the berm. And so the floodwaters surrounded the building. Now, the other bad news is the basement and the first floor of the facility became flooded. Now, the bad news is that when they moved the generators, they had left a vent into the building. And so that water was not only went around the building, but it actually went into the building. Rich, am I in slide 39 as far as you can see right now?
Yes, that's correct, Nick.
Okay. I got a lot of messages coming in here.
Yeah, confirm privately where you are.
Yeah. So the bottom line was that they did some good job on their HVA, but on their second HVA, they didn't actually do a walk around and identify that vent hole. And they ended up evacuating some 250 residents. Many were floated out in building linen hampers as makeshift rafts, but just an example of how an HVA could work well and maybe not work so well. A couple of side notes on the particular tool that we provided you. When you look at the tool, there often is in the upper right-hand corner, kind of circle it right there, a little red triangle. If you click on that, it will give you more information. So for many things throughout here, you'll see them up here where it'll give you the scoring, but that's how these Excel spreadsheets work for you. All right? The next tab that I hope you're seeing, which is slide 41, is technological hazards. So the next thing you'll do is go through this laundry list of issues on what your technological potential hazards are. And those include things that we obviously care about, and this is where it's good to have facilities involved, and brings us back to that multidisciplinary approach. You know, electrical failure. If we lose commercial power, what are we okay? And typically, in most facilities, the answer is yes. We got a generator go on. All right, so we're good. We score it accordingly. Okay, the next question is, what if that generator fails? Okay, now what's the impact? Do we have two generators? Is there redundancy? Is there parallel? So that's where all these questions come in for any of these issues: transportation, fuel, natural gas, water, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to go through each one of those technological events and ask all those same questions. Including under technological events is hazardous materials. So you need to take a look internally. Do we have potential for hazardous material spills? And that could include fuel oil. It could include mercury if you're not a mercury-free facility. Do you have any specific chemicals that you're concerned about? Do we have a potential for internal spills? But it also, of course, includes external hazardous materials. And that goes back to our earlier view of looking beyond your facility, what's in your local neighborhood. A good example of this, I was working with a hospital facility recently. They've done their HVA religiously every year. 2018, we brought in the fire department. We're going through the list. We talk about external chemical hazards, and they're like, yeah, not likely. They were nowhere near anything important. And the fire department literally stopped them in their tracks and said, well, actually, you don't know this, but right down the road on East Aurora Street, they're going to be building, and we've been meeting regularly on this, a chemical factory. And this is a factory that literally is going to take chemicals and custom mix them for clients. And obviously that was a big deal and made them revisit that. Okay, I'm on slide 43, perfect. And revisit that. So not only are you concerned about transportation, hazardous materials, but also facilities that might be near you. The next tab is really about human hazards, and specifically it goes through a kind of a laundry list of potential human hazards that include things like missing resident. And I want to make sure we make a really specific point on this. a lot of the HVAs and risk assessments that are out there don't specifically call out missing resident, and that is the one hazard that CMS specifically says you need to consider. So make sure whatever version you're using includes missing resident. But it should also include other human hazards such as civil disobedience, forensic admissions, and other things like that. We're going to take a pause there and let Rich give us poll question number 2. Rich, you can get your folks out there. So let's stop for a second there and ask you folks, out of everybody that's conducted a formal assessment, have you done it with an internal team and community partners, or have you included local, regional, and state partners? All right, looks like everybody's involving at least some of their community partners and certainly some of their state and regional partners. So we can't stress enough the importance of involving your community, your local coordinating healthcare coalitions, and others as part of this process. It's meant to be both a information sharing process as well as an opportunity to find out what other hazards are in and around your facilities or where you are. When we, and then of course also included in human hazards is the active shooter hazard. So we do all that work on creating things. This is what we would consider an all hazards approach, but I want to just mention that in this tool that we've provided you, there are opportunities to add other things. If there's a hazard that you want to reflect on and include in your HVA, you can do that by going down on that hazard list, and you'll find other 1, 2, or 3, and you just type in the hazard, and it will now be included in the calculations and everything else. So it's what we consider to be all hazard, but I'm sure there's some things out there that we have not come across. The latest Kaiser Permanente model actually goes from A to Z. It starts with avalanche and ends with zombie apocalypse. So I'll just leave it at that. That's a true story. I'm not saying you need to have that on your HVAs, but they do have that as kind of a inside joke. So you complete your HVA, what now? Well, your HVA should provide you with some sort of summary, because the whole purpose of this HVA is to take and distill down all these hazards and identify what our top potential hazards are, right? And so you should be looking at what your top natural, technological, human are, and what your 10 top overall are. And with that, you're going to want to make sure that you're addressing those hazards. You may not always be able to do something, but you need to at least be considering, what are we doing? What should we be doing? And so we're going to take a second now and actually pull up quickly poll number 3. So we could ask you folks, having looked at that all hazard list, what concerns you most? What do you think your high hazards will fall under? Natural, technological, or human events? Yeah, not surprisingly, natural events. Totally get it, totally expect it, and I would expect that as well. And that's pretty much what we see with most providers, across the country, not just in Florida. The biggest issues that rise to the top are natural events. So what do you do when you have that list, right? What do you do? Well, we said that you need to do a couple of things with those risks. And one of those things include, of course, looking at mitigation plans. So how do you develop mitigation plans? Well, you should review the risk and identify basically what can you do to minimize the risk. Is it collaboration with other partners? And so one example of that would be active shooter, where a year or so ago that was coming up high on everybody's risk assessments. And the obvious answer is, let's bring the PD in and talk to them. Do they have a program where they can give us some training? Do they have suggestions? Will they look at our facility and provide us an analysis, a security analysis? Should we be pulling in some outside resources to do that? Another question is, can we be doing some more planning, right? So if a loss of IT comes up high because we're now concerned about cybersecurity and cyber threats, then, well, we certainly could be doing some infrastructure improvement to that, but most people are doing everything they can. So the next question is, can we be doing some more planning around that so we can respond better? Do we have downtime procedures for everything in our organization? Do we have a quick response from our IT or our corporate IT or our vendors? Do we have MOUs with our vendors? So again, as you're looking at these top 10 or top 5, the high risks that are identified, you need to reflect, what can I be doing to minimize the risk? And it might be any one of these things, or it might be all of them, or be none of them. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's only so much you can do about weather events, right? And so, that you there in the southeast and us up here in the northeast with our snowstorms, snowstorms, blizzards for us comes up high every time. And if we have good staffing plans in place, we have good snow removal plans in place, we have vendors on standby. If you down in the southeast have hurricane shutters, have good staffing plans, have vendors to come in to clear debris on standby, and you have everything you can in place, then there is a point where potentially that risk is just always going to be a high risk. And that's just good to recognize. It's good to know. But it still is part of your process to revisit that regularly to see if there is something that you can be doing differently. Because at the very least, maybe it's training or maybe it's exercise development. So we have an example here of a facility, and I'll back up on that for a second, and they identified their natural hazards. Their top natural hazards were tornado, hurricane, and earthquake and blizzard. This is obviously up in the Northeast. Their technological hazards were generator failure, and you can see that, human hazards, and then the hazmat hazards. And when we drill down, just to give you 2 examples, there we are. For the generator failure, which ranked at 48%, the reason is that they had 2 generators, but there was no redundancy. And so they scored themselves pretty high in those areas. They had no external connection or quick connect, and their external generator could be used, but they knew that it would take quite a bit of setup and things like that. So they, much like many facilities in Florida today, are revisiting the generators, and are they sized correctly? Can they do some infrastructure improvements to have an outside quick connect and set up an MOU? And so this year, this is actually 2017, but through that year, they looked at that and made some decisions on what they possibly could do to mitigate that risk. Not required to do it, but consider it to mitigate that risk. Loss of water is another example. They had only one main feeding the campus. They're in an old part of the city. They wanted to consider alternate water supply connections and storage. So they were, again, looking to see if they could provide a quick connect so they can get tankers in. And at the very least, they were going to beef up their on-site water supply. So 2 examples of mitigation plans for that. With that, we want to leave you with a couple of resources and give you an opportunity for any questions. I think we did have one question here, a couple of questions. We will provide a copy of the slides. I believe we'll post them into the system. We'll work with the folks in the region to get those to you. The other question was, do you have to have a policy for every event or just for the top 10? The answer is, I don't think there's any requirement, there is no requirement to have a policy or a plan for everything on that list. I would definitely consider that you need to have a procedure and a plan for your top events, all right? So it's all based on your HVA. Many times, things that are not in your top 10 are included in more general plans like weather events and more all hazards, and that's okay too. With that, we're going to leave you with a couple of resources, and you'll probably be seeing these again. CMS does a lot of things. This particular one they do well. CMS.gov is a great place to go for resources under the emergency preparedness rule. You'll find a lot of good information under there. I mentioned already ASPR Tracy. It's a great resource for everything from HVAs to templates of plans. I know we all like to we hate to start with a blank piece of paper, so that's a great opportunity to find templates and sample plans for everything from tornadoes and hurricanes to active shooter to general EOPs, emergency operations plans. And let's see if I can get you guys to where I am. So that's ASPR Tracy. And then finally, we just also want to offer ourselves as a resource. Certainly feel free to give me an email if you got any questions following this. I'm, again, Nick Gabriele, and Gabriele at phillipsllc.com. Visit our website. We have a lot of good information about resources and links and things that we could help provide you with as well. And with that, I appreciate your time this afternoon. I hope you got something out of this. Go forward, work with your facilities, identify your hazards, and build your emergency preparedness programs to keep yourselves, your residents, and your providers safe. Thanks, and have a great day.